I've been asked to relate miraculous things that I've witnessed. In 1993, I had the privilege to preach at the 50th anniversary of the founding of First Assembly of God in Brownsville, Tennessee. While there, a man in his late 40s approached me and asked if I remembered an occasion when which a very distraught woman came running to our door with an infant in her arms, saying to my dad, "I believed what you preached about divine healing. I prayed, I've confessed, I've trusted. Here my baby is dead. Now you take him. I don't know what to do." The man continued to say, "Your dad took the child and cried out to God, and while he was praying, the child began to move, and in just a few moments was perfectly well." As he told the story, I began to recall the event and remember the very spot in the yard in which I was standing. And it all began to come back to me. And upon my reply that I recalled the event, he said to me, "I am that man. I am that baby. I'm that child. I've been extremely healthy person from that time till now." While pastoring in Danceyville, Tennessee in 1967, my wife and I had 2 children by that time. One of them is still an infant. And we were living in a building that had been the old church building, been converted into living quarters. And an extremely cold morning, about 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning, my wife woke me up and said to me, "Honey, we have got to go down to Ms. Davis's house." Now, Ms. Davis, I knew who she was. She was not an attendant of our church. She had a son that did attend. And I had known of this family from years before. And she was a very bitter person, claimed to not even believe in God. And it had been as cold and as extremely cold as it was that morning, and my automobile that was very reluctant to start on cold mornings. I was reluctant to do what my wife had told me that God had spoke to her that we were to do. But she finally convinced me, and I said, "All right, on one condition, if the car will start." And so she got the kids, wrapped them up in blankets and put them in the car, and sure enough, the car started. And then I began to make other excuses because it was a trip down about 4 miles down the highway, paved highway, and then we turned to a gravel road for about a mile, and it had an iron gate that was usually locked there to the woman's property. And then down about another quarter mile, there was a dirt lane, and to go up to the old house that was and had a wire gap at it that you would have to get out of the car and open. And at each of those places, I protested that if that gate wasn't open and if that gap was not open, I would not go, because I knew this woman had been prone to shoot at anybody that she saw on her property. But as I come and turned onto the gravel road, the iron gate was open, so I drove up to where the wire gap was, and it was open. And I got within sight of the house. I cut my lights off the car, and I told Faye, I said, "I will not approach that house unless I see some sign of life or somebody up at this time of the morning." And so as I coasted up close to the house and had rolled down a glass, I heard a man crying out to me. It turned out to be this lady's son. And then he told me, he said, "Brother Worley, I knew you was coming. A mother has claimed there was no God, but she's got something that struck her, and she is in the midst of dying, and I didn't want to leave her and let her die alone. I had no way of calling anybody because she didn't have a phone in the house. And he didn't, I don't know if he was aware of it or not, but we didn't have a phone that we could have received a call. But he said, Mom, please. He said, I told her, Mom, please cry out to God and get some help. And she says, I don't know there's a God. I don't know that there's a God. I've denied there's a God. And he said, well, I'm going to prove to you there is a God because I'm going to pray. And God's going to get my pastor up out of his bed and bring him down here to pray for you. And that's the reason you're here. And so we went in, and she agreed to let me pray for her, but she was screaming. She was literally pulling her hair out and screaming to the top of her voice and said, I've denied that there's a God or that there's a hell, but I am in hell because the flames are leaping around me. As we began to pray for her, I said, well, listen, would you let's just believe God. And I began to rebuke the power of Satan and to God to grant her forgiveness as she would call upon him. And I said, woman, Ms. Davids, if you will call on God, God will redeem your soul right now. He has redeemed it, and you can know it. And she finally agreed as I led her in a prayer. And as we began to pray, she began to say that the flames are receding, they're going, they're going, they're going, they're gone. And she was totally touched and made whole that very morning and got up out of that bed and began to confess that what she had denied all of her life was now a reality. She had found the reality that there is a God and that He would hear her prayers. The following week, we had an activity at the church that she came and attended it. And when we had a meal and was able to give her testimony of how that God had worked a miraculous thing to bring her to a point of salvation. I'll never forget that as long as I live. In 1965, on a Sunday evening, it was December the 26th, the day following Christmas of that year, when Nelson attended our church for the first time. He'd grown up in Cookeville and had gone off to Michigan working in automobile plants and had been injured on the job, and his back had been broken. He had come back and was recouping and was having constant pain. It had been 2 years, and yet he had no ability to do anything more than get up and sit with a cane and sit in a chair. He could not even pick up his own shoes or allow his 3-year-old son to get on his lap. Was taking about 8 to 10 pain pills a day, all that the doctor would give him. But he had come to church that night, and while I was preaching, I sensed that he was in terrible pain and called him up for prayer. And when I laid hands on him, he hit the floor completely, collapsed and hit the floor. But just in a matter of moments, he began to move, and then he began to twist, and he began to get up, and he rose up with no help and began to bend over and touch his toes and twist from side to side, something that I found out later he had not been able to do for years. And I waxed bold, and I said, Brother Nelson, God has just healed you. He looked back at me and he said, Pastor, if I'm healed, I'm well. And if I'm well, then I'm able to go back to work. And I'm going to find out tomorrow for sure whether I'm healed. And on Wednesday night of that same week, he came back to service and got up to testify and told me, he said, on Monday morning I got up, there was a fence row on my property that had been all grown up with vines and brush and things, and he said, I got a grubbing hoe and an axe, and I worked all day long cleaning up that fence row. And he said, I didn't even get sore. And he began to twist and turn over and touch his toes. And he said, tomorrow I'm going out and looking for a job because God, I will confess to you now that God did perform a miracle Sunday night. In 1983, The last time I got to interview Carlos, he was still faithful to church. And I asked him, I said, what about that back? And he said, I've never had even as much as a backache in all these years. That was almost 20-year period of time that he was still well, giving testimony. He said, I've had a few stomach aches, but never another backache in all these years since the moment that you prayed for me there that Sunday night after Christmas. I'm here to tell you that God is still the same, and I've seen recent miracles as well. Somewhere around 1968 or 9, while living and pastoring in Lexington, Tennessee, we lived next door to one of the prominent doctors in town, Dr. Max Crocker. My two sons and his son were involved in a football game one afternoon, and someone kicked my son Kenny's somehow or another, and Dr. Crocker's son got a hold of his daddy, and they rushed to the hospital there in Lexington, and I got a call to come. When I got there, they had already x-rayed Kenny's hand, and he was wanting permission to perform an operation on it because it showed that 2 of his fingers were broken, and the wrist was extremely damaged. And Dr. Crocker asked for my permission. I gave him permission, signed the permission slip, and he said, I've got to have a radiologist here that's going to join me to see how we're going to go about performing this needed surgery. And while he was gone to get the radiologist, Kenny looked at me and he said, Daddy, it hurts so bad. And I reached and took my hand and put it under his hand, and I laid my other hand on top of his hand and prayed. And when I moved my hand, he began to move his and begin to open and close his fingers like this. By that time, Dr. Crocker had turned and had come back, and he was standing there and watched it. And he said to me, he said, well, preacher, looks like God's already did the operation that I was going to do. But he went ahead and x-rayed the hand again. And then when the radiologist came and looked at these, he said, there's no way that both these x-rays are of the same hand on the same person. This one is definitely broken. This one definitely has nothing wrong with it. I want you to know that God is a healer. He was then, He still is now. And I thank God for it. In 1993, I had the privilege of preaching at a 50th anniversary celebration of the founding of the First Assembly of God in Brownsville, Tennessee. And while I was there, I was approached by an individual that was somewhere near in the upper 40s and said to me, said, Brother Ken, said, do you remember a time when there was a lady that was totally frustrated come running to your dad with a baby in her arms and said to him, Brother Worley, I believe what you preached about divine healing. And I've been trusting God, and I trusted God for the healing of this baby. I prayed, I sought God, and I confessed. But now my baby's dead. Here, take him. Do something with him. I don't know what to do. And he said, your dad took the baby and prayed a prayer. And while he was praying, this baby began to squirm and began to revive. And in just a matter of minutes, he was able to hand back to that lady a well-healed child. And as he told that, I began to remember. I remember also where I was standing in the yard at the time that this occurred. And I said to him, yes, I remember that. And he said, well, I want you to know something. I am that baby. And I've been very rarely have I been sick of any kind in all these years. And as I tell this, as I've been requested to repeat this, It's a part of the history of that church that I had a privilege of writing. But I thank God that not only did He do things like that then, He is still the God that heals. As recent as 1999, while I was ministering in India, in a tribal village 2 hours away from Madras, I stepped off of the platform out into the crowd because I saw an old man that I felt like I had to go out and pray with. And while I was praying with him, I turned, and right beside him was a man that was very apparently demonic. I mean, he was in a rage. And I felt compelled to rebuke Satan out of his life. I turned and demanded Satan to let him go. And he certainly became calm, suddenly. And standing right behind me on the other side was a little fellow about 10 years old. And somebody with him grabbed a hold of my garment, my shirt, and began to scream, "He can see, he can see, he can see." And I asked, was the child not able to see before? And they managed to tell me, no, he's been blind all of his life. But right now, he has vision. Well, the following night, I preached in that village, and the man that I had rebuked this satanic attack from was sitting right up as close as you could get to where the platform was. But no one told me anything that had occurred about him until after we had ministered throughout that service and ready to go home. And on the way back to the hotel, the pastor who had taken me out there, transporting me, said, "You know that man you went out and rebuked that devil out of last night?" And I said, "Yes." I noticed he was up by the platform tonight. And he said, "Well, let me tell you what happened. He had been blind for 38 years as a result of demon possession. And when you rebuked that spirit out of him last night, his vision came back to him, and he was sitting up there tonight observing everything that was going on because he has totally received his sight." Well, what amazed me so much was not only did he receive sight, but the young fellow just standing there that had never seen, the 10-year-old, was seeing for the first time of his life. This is just a sample of things that I've witnessed that God has done and allowed me to be present when He did them. God bless you.